All right, let's dive right in. Welcome, CSS and KPPMS 2026 aspirants, to this exclusive explainer. We're guided today by the brilliant insights of instructor Tausifik Balkan. Now, if you're serious about acing your exams, you'll definitely want to join us for the preparation of all compulsory subjects of CSS and KPPMS 2026. And hey, make sure to subscribe to Dawn Times so you don't miss out on any of our deep dives. Today, we're unpacking an absolute goldmine for your economics and Pakistan affairs papers, Akbar Zaidi's highly influential book, Issues in Pakistan's Economy. We're going to distill his massive volume of work into high-yield, exam-ready concepts and figure out exactly what's going on beneath the surface of the country's economic data.
Here's our roadmap for the explainer today. We'll kick things off with the underperformance myth, move into the rentier state, break down the TDEIC framework, examine the human toll, and finally, map out the path forward.
So, Section 1, the underperformance myth. We're looking at a crisis versus a chronic state.
Zaidi's bold thesis starts right here. He argues the economy isn't going through some sudden, unpredictable crisis. Actually, it's in a chronic, deliberate state of underperformance, driven entirely by elite capture. The argument is kind of fascinating when you think about it. Basically, Pakistan already has the resources it needs to grow. Fundamentally, it's a rich country. But the people remain poor because the ruling elite, we're talking landlords, industrialists, traders, the military, bureaucratic establishment, they just don't want to pay for the functioning of the state. So it's a political choice, not a lack of economic potential.
And this idea perfectly explains why historical GDP spikes never really translated into actual poverty reduction for the masses. You might be thinking, wait a minute, Pakistan has had periods of 6 to 7% GDP growth, right? And that's absolutely true. But Zaidi draws a really sharp line between mere growth and actual development. The growth the country experienced was heavily driven by domestic consumption and foreign remittances. It wasn't driven by building industries or boosting exports or creating sustainable jobs. Because of that, even during the big boom years, inequality stayed incredibly high and poverty didn't really drop.
Moving right along to Section 2, the rentier state. This is all about growth without accountability.
According to Zaidi, Pakistan operates as a rentier state. What does that mean? Well, it means the state relies heavily on external rent just to keep the lights on. We're talking foreign aid, IMF loans, and all those remittances sent home by hardworking citizens abroad. The really crucial point here is that because the state runs on external funding instead of taking money directly from its citizens through widespread taxation, it completely bypasses democratic accountability. Think about it. When a government doesn't actually need your taxes to survive, it's way less motivated to listen to your demands for better public services or major economic reform. Which brings us to a frankly staggering data point for your exams: 9%. Pakistan's tax-to-GDP ratio hovers around just 9 to 10%. To put that into perspective for a second, out of a population of roughly 240 million people, only about 2 million actually file income taxes. It's an incredibly narrow tax base. Plus, about 70% of the taxes that are collected are indirect. That means they're applied to everyday goods and services, which disproportionately burdens the poor, while the wealthy remain largely exempt.
To see this elite capture in action, you don't have to look any further than the agriculture sector. It commands a massive 20%, a full fifth of the country's entire GDP. But guess what? It contributes a meager 0.1% to the total tax revenue. That's practically zero. This sector is heavily shielded by powerful landlords who make sure they don't have to pay up, which unfortunately keeps agriculture stuck in a low-productivity, feudal model.
All right, Section 3, we're breaking down the TDEIC framework, covering the 5 core issues.
Now, this framework is the ultimate mnemonic device for your essays, perfectly aligning Zaidi's analysis with the exact statistics you need to cite. Let's break it down. T is for taxation crisis, which we just touched on, a narrow base that's afraid to tax the rich, stuck at a 9% tax-to-GDP ratio. Then we have D for deindustrialization. Zaidi notes that energy crises, an overvalued rupee, and a flood of cheap imports have severely damaged local industry, leaving manufacturing at just 13% of GDP. Next is E for elite capture, which is heavily present in sectors like agriculture and real estate. I stands for international aid and debt dependency. Without self-reliance, this has led to a massive external debt exceeding $130 billion. Finally, C is for chronic trade deficit. Pakistan continuously imports way more consumer goods than it exports, with exports historically just stagnating around the $30 billion mark. This TDEIC framework is literally the structural engine of Pakistan's economic woes.
That brings us to Section 4, the human toll on social sectors and capital.
The data we're dealing with here is incredibly sobering. The government spends less than 2.5% of its GDP on education and health combined. Just think about that for a second. Because of this heavily misplaced priority, literacy and health indicators are still really poor. This massive underinvestment has naturally led to a boom in private schools and hospitals, effectively creating two Pakistans, one for the elite who can afford private services and one for the masses who simply can't. By failing to invest in human capital, the state is taking a potential youth dividend and turning it into a demographic burden. You end up with millions of young people trapped in the informal sector without any real job security or modern skills.
And all of this builds into an inescapable loop. The inevitable result of low taxes, low exports, and low human capital is a vicious boom-bust cycle. Here's how it plays out. The country runs out of foreign exchange, which leads straight to an IMF program. Now, the IMF program stabilizes the economy temporarily. It essentially stops the bleeding. But it completely fails to trigger the deep structural reforms that are actually needed. So the country just takes on new loans to pay off the old loans, which drives up severe inflation, and the cycle just repeats itself endlessly.
Finally, Section 5, the path forward. Let's talk recommendations and reform.
Zaidi outlines 5 crucial steps here. First up, tax the rich. This means implementing strict taxes on agriculture, property, and the retail sector, and absolutely no more tax amnesties. Second, invest in people. He suggests raising spending on education and health to 4% of the GDP each. Third, implement a robust industrial policy. Provide cheap energy and export subsidies, but put a hard stop to importing luxury goods. Fourth, end the aid mentality by actually living within the country's means and significantly reducing reliance on the IMF and the US. And fifth, enact deep political reform. Zaidi really emphasizes that a civilian government has got to fully reclaim economic policy to drive these structural changes forward.
Now, to make sure your exam answers are balanced and highly analytical, it's totally vital to mention the academic criticisms of Zaidi's work. Some critics argue his outlook is just a bit too pessimistic, especially since the book was written before the first phase of CPEC, the recent IT exports boom, and the surge in post-COVID remittances. On top of that, critics point out that he largely overlooks a massive, undocumented informal economy, which is estimated to be around 35% of the GDP. And lastly, while he says the elite absolutely must reform, he doesn't really give a practical step-by-step roadmap on how to actually force them to do so. Dropping these critiques into your essays will definitely elevate your answers.
But even with those critiques in mind, we always return to the core truth of his work. Pakistan's problem is not lack of resources, it is lack of will to mobilize those resources. Ultimately, the absolute most crucial takeaway from Zaidi's analysis is that economic stagnation in Pakistan is a deliberate political choice. The wealth is there, the capacity is there. It's the systemic protection of elite interests that's keeping the country from moving forward.
So, I'll leave you with this provocative question to ponder for your CSS and KPPMS 2026 preparations. Will the elite ever voluntarily reform a system they benefit from so heavily, or will change have to come from somewhere else? A huge thanks to instructor Tausif Iqbal Khan for his brilliant guidance on this material. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to join us for the preparation of all compulsory subjects of CSS and KPPMS 2026, and don't forget to subscribe to Dawn Times for more essential explainers. Keep studying hard, and we'll catch you in the next one.